28 Years Later is greenlit and in full production, bringing back 28 Days Later director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland to a cast of Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Ralph Fiennes. Not only will we finally get the sequel we've been waiting for after a decade and a half, bolstering a $75 million budget, but this will also be the first of a new trilogy with plans to shoot a sequel soon after. With all this hype though, there were a few things in the back of my mind. 28 Weeks Later released in 2007, ending in a massive cliffhanger. Hordes of infected emerging from tunnels to flood into Paris with the Eiffel Tower in view, leaving it up to viewers for a nightmarish interpretation. The concept of the pandemic breaching containment of the British Isles to invade mainland Europe pretty much mandated a sequel, but it never happened. It definitely felt like the natural succession for the franchise was to be 28 months later. And back 10 years ago, it was, until it was left in writer purgatory. 28 months might have been feasible, but how would a nearly 3-decade time skip make much sense?
Why now? Why not 20 years ago?
Considering it isn't a generic zombie outbreak, but a pandemic of living people infected with the Rage virus. Well, let's look into the possible scenarios and what could be. Today, we are discussing how will 28 years later be possible? The rage infected may never sleep, but you can beat the rage of fatigue with some shut-eye thanks to today's sponsor, Manta Sleep. I was recently diagnosed with sleep apnea, so getting a good night's sleep was always a pain. After getting my own Manta Sleep mask, I have noted a way better rest. Hell, between maintaining my army of cats, house maintenance, and stressing over YouTube, I was naturally restless and having a hard time conking out. But the second I slapped on the Manta Sound sleep mask, I was instantly snoozing. Heading the ProNap movement, Manta Sleep works to bring back your vitality and deliver you the nap you deserve. Let's face it, we could all use a second morning leveled nap, especially after staring at screens all day. It's surprisingly comfortable and nice to the touch. The Bluetooth headphones are snug and perfectly mask all outside noise. It's cool and breezy thanks to the perforated materials for naturally warm people like myself. And it's easily adjustable to meet the needs of my big-ass head. Become a better survivor in day-to-day life and unlock your full potential with a Manta Sleep mask. Check out Manta Sleep by following the link in the description and pinned comment below, and use this code on screen and below at checkout for 10% off your order. Thanks again to Manta Sleep for sponsoring today's video. The universe holding the Rage virus is absolutely no stranger to the man-made pathogen suddenly breaking out, starting in 28 Days Later from an animal research facility being attacked by eco-terrorists and unintentionally releasing infected chimps, mainland Great Britain being completely eradicated by the plague. Survivors fighting the blighted and each other until eventually dwindling numbers and starvation wiped out the infected populace. Until the US and UK carted in hundreds of Brits back into a quarantine zone to recolonize the region, all while cleansing efforts were still well underway, then allowed 2 kids to break quarantine, find their infected mother, have her brought back with no security, with her known husband with all access that kisses her out of guilt only to get infected, then spurring the army to put all civilians in a basement like fish in a barrel, and then starting a second outbreak. And then, despite gunning people down, firebombing London, and flamethrower squads melting Hawkeye, this time around the infection did get to mainland Europe, with nothing coming up on how any of that played out, with one boy being a carrier of the disease with none of the violent symptoms as he flies away. The Rage virus was contained when it was completely unknown of what it was in its first incarnation. In the virus's revival, even with the colossal screw-up that was the second Rage outbreak of London, eventually the spread would have been walled off and contained to a semi-decently massive area, using natural borders like rivers or making walls miles away from infected as they are progressing. After time, the infected numbers numbers would stop progressing as the infected would eventually die out. It would never be something like The Walking Dead's universe where the zombies have taken over the world and continue to exist indefinitely, never really dying. The infected cannot fundamentally survive longer than a few weeks due to the severe toll the rage virus puts on the human body. The infected are living people, never eating, drinking, sleeping, and vomiting copious amounts of blood, only ever really getting any sustenance from the few chunks of meat some infected get from sinking their teeth in their victims. Inevitably, all infected will die from either dehydration, hunger, exhaustion, cardiac arrest, or blood loss, meaning their outbreak will die out quickly once decent barriers are erected and they cannot bolster their numbers with healthy individuals. All of this canonically occurring in 2002, it actually could make a lot more sense for the series to progress from weeks to years, and trimming out the predicted 28-month sequel. 28 months being a little over 2 years after the end of both outbreaks. If that were the case, these rage pandemics would still be fresh on the minds of the world and considered international incidents and tragedies. One for the history books. A pandemic that effectively destroyed a major country twice. One that displayed the failures of American and British militaries and governments that bled into Europe, causing countless casualties and damage, defying all known medical science. An infection that spreads faster than any known to man, and with the bloodiest results. Footage of the chaos and the sheer thought of this destructive disease existing would cause long-term harm to the world. People debating if it could go airborne, if it could be spread through food and water, discrimination of British people thinking that those with accents or posh looks could be carriers of the disease. There would be British discrimination. The world would not be the same for a bit. If it were 28 months later, this would all realistically be a thing, but 28 years later would have the fears, precautions, and readiness of everyone fade that is far from it. As shown in civilized human history, especially in recent era, when it comes to diseases, outbreaks, and national tragedies, people will tend to forget and or move on from them at a relatively faster and faster pace, as if these critical events were from a bygone era, despite its recency and severity. It's very likely something like this will be a keynote within the plot of 28 years later. Failure to remember and acknowledge a threat and its ramifications, for people to not learn from history so that we may be doomed to repeat it. It won't be the reason for the outbreak, but this will be a defining factor in how the third outbreak breaks out as much as it does. People either underestimating the virus, being unprepared for something very well known, or just simply ignoring it altogether until it comes to a head. All of this so 3 sequels could be made. So how could the rage virus start and then spread out 28 years later though? It is possible that the infection did spread through most of Europe, causing kind of a dystopian wasteland for the first part in the eastern part of the globe after the virus died out. Most of the eastern world would rekindle itself in the 28 years following in a very slow but steady manner. Extremely small portions of the population, I mean like 0.1% or even lower, would be carriers that live on long after the pandemic. Maybe this new East would segregate, quarantine, or even execute anyone with the trademark red eyes, or simply those that hail from Britain, since it was ground zero to the worst pandemic in human history. We have to remember that this is the most contagious disease ever, so carriers would definitely go into hiding just like Alice did in her old home in 28 weeks later, lest they be killed. Carriers would be pariahs, modern day lepers, but with way more stigmatism. The potential of them starting another outbreak would be far more threatening than the chance of trying to make a cure or vaccine from their genome and blood. The public would want them dead and their bodies burned, so it would make sense for any carriers to go into hiding to avoid it all. These hiding carriers would possibly sneak into cities to procure supplies and food every once in a while wearing shades or disguise disguises to mask their red eyes. That is, until one day their identity is accidentally revealed, and the weary public creates a skirmish that leads to one of these carriers accidentally infecting a healthy person via either drawing blood in a fight or from a deep cut, or even a drop of saliva that enters a nearby healthy individual. Hell, maybe the teenager of a parent carrier that was pregnant from these people sneaks out and pulls a freaking daunt and kisses a healthy person or something. Or maybe they get in a fight and they infect someone. Or maybe the healthy public finds one of these carriers and executes them in a very bloody manner, forgetting that even a single drop of blood or bodily fluid means turning as the splatter gets into one of their eyes or mouths, starting a new outbreak from the rushed and careless murder of an infected. Because it has been so long since the original outbreak that many people would not remember the exact details of how infection starts. Maybe there's misinformation that they think it's like zombies and it only spreads through bites. Any reason for these outcast carriers to inadvertently spark a new outbreak in the very fear-driven, weary, and uninformed public? I personally think this concept is most likely, or at least the most interesting. Maybe a massive vaccination event would occur. The sole reason for Andy being saved in 28 weeks later was to make a cure or vaccine from his body, since it staved off the effects of the rage virus. However, the vaccines being made would either be rushed out too quickly or meddled with by outside forces to cause disarray, maybe making a dead form of the virus that will lie dormant in people until 28 years later, when a third pandemic triggers the virus for everyone to suddenly turn into infected. Most consider the rage virus to either be a mutation or a variant of rabies. And if you know anything about rabies, a cure would never come because it is prionic in nature. A vaccine would definitely be tried to be made in desperation for global safety concerns. Maybe having the rage virus finally crossing the pond to the west so that the United States, Canada, Mexico, and more have to face the infected via this method. But considering the political discourse of COVID and the vaccines around it, I sincerely think things will not play out this way. It's just a lot of shit that will hit the fan if that were to happen. That and vaccinating and or curing this disease will most likely never happen, since again, it is derived from rabies. Now, with many major post-apocalyptic films, it's very possible we could get the tried and true method of action storytelling, where the US military sees the potential use for a virus this destructive that dies off in a short amount of time, repurposing the rage virus for militarized efforts in biochemical warfare. We have seen it time and time again, and it's possible here, possibly using it as a chemical or gaseous agent sprayed down from above to turn enemies into infected quickly that turn on their comrades and then go hog wild, only for military troops and fire strikes to come back a few weeks later to burn the remains of the infected that have died out. And of course, for the events of the movie, before this can be weaponized, this infection will breach containment from a military compound before it could be used, and this being the catalyst for 28 years later, becoming out of control across whatever country it was being housed in. Maybe it starts in Britain again. Now, to get ridiculous for a moment from here on out, the first half of this video I'm trying to be serious, and now I'm going to just throw out some joke ideas. Maybe the CDC took a sample of the rage virus for themselves to study and then fucked up and let it loose. Kinda like how the simian flu started in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, where it was sprayed onto one guy's face at Genesis Laboratories in San Francisco and then accidentally and unknowingly infected him as he sneezed on a pilot, where it spread across the world. So maybe it's a new form of rage virus that can lie dormant in a person for longer than a few seconds, allowing it to be discreetly spread at first, so there is much more infected when it finally hits the fan. Or shit, maybe military scientists restructured the rage virus to maybe go airborne and become hyper-mutative, turning 28 years later into an unintended Left 4 Dead live-action movie, since the infected in the Left 4 Dead series are directly inspired by this franchise. This would be a Hollywood attempt to make it interesting to more people to have the mutating infected like boomers, witches, smokers, hunters, tanks, and more. Like The Walking Dead trying walker variants. Why not try it here? Please don't do this, by the way. Do not do this. But whatever the reasoning is for this next pandemic, it will never be dumber than how 28 weeks later started with Don kissing his infected wife in a highly secure area. But hey, what do I know? Hollywood likes to prove me wrong. Maybe Andy, the carrier kid from 28 weeks later, after being rescued and brought to the United States, was the patient zero in a US outbreak. Maybe Andy grew up in America after failed attempts at making a cure from his blood, and then we just let him leave and live a normal life until he kisses a girl in New York City and starts a rage pandemic there. Or maybe Andy is kept in isolation in a scientific lab for all these years, and his sister Tammy, after years of separation from her brother, hatches a plan that leads to her breaking in to save him from captivity, basically as a nod to 28 days later and the eco-terrorists trying to save the monkeys that started the Britain pandemic. However, this time, with inspiration from Don and his wife starting the second outbreak, does Tammy accidentally get infected while trying to save her brother during her rescue mission, and then starts a new outbreak. It's awesome because it makes you think, whoa, it's just like the old movies and how those started. Remember those? Nostalgia. If this movie were in the hands of those that wrote something like World War Z, Zombieland 2, or Zack Snyder, I could see this being the reason the third outbreak happens. But you know what? I have faith in Alex Garland and Danny Boyle to not pull this stunt. And I'm sure they'll come up with a decent explanation as to either how the infection stayed around for 28 years or as to why it came back with enough force to make a new trilogy of films 28 years later. Actually, it's more like 18 years later in our timeline. But still, that about ends today's predictions into the future. Will I have the gift of prophecy like Apollo? Or will this video be a crock of shit? What do you think will be the reasoning behind a third rage pandemic, and what will begin the events of 28 years later? Do you think such a large time skip is necessary? Or is it only so that any returning characters from the 2002 and 2007 movies and their age differences make sense? Do you think we really should have stuck to the months, or is it okay to jump to years? I'm still very excited to see a return to the rage virus, as its infected are probably the scariest zombie-like entities to ever come from fiction, as they redefined the zombie genre altogether, despite not being zombies but infected. What do you hope to see? Let's have a discussion down in the comments, as I'll love to see your ideas and concepts. You might have noticed my voice sounds different. I had a major tonsillectomy on April 15th, and I'm still recovering, but I am pushing through it. But my uvula feels like it's a sack full of drugs that I'm trying to smuggle into prison. So I'm sorry if I sound a little weird, but hopefully I'll be able to recover in the weeks coming. Thank you to Chago, aka QuickFlix, for editing today's video together. Special shout out to my Patreon patrons and YouTube channel members for donating to the channel to be featured on this list here. Until next time, I'm Zackass, aka WowSuch Gaming. Never forget to stay happy, stay healthy, keep the rage away, and most importantly, stay wow.